Out of nowhere, Sony has just dropped the first details of the PS5 Controller. We still don't know a lot about the actual system itself, aside from Mark Cerny's very in-depth discussion of the hardware inside of it, but we actually now have a look at what the new PS5 DualSense controller is going to look like. Before we get into some of the features they talked about with this controller, let's take a real quick look at just what it even looks like, because it is, honestly, I think the most drastic redesign PlayStation has ever done. When you look at the history of PlayStation controllers, which traditionally are called DualShocks, it's been very slow over time. PS1 to PS2 was very minor, PS2 to PS3 was even more so, aside from the fact that they were now wireless and they had the soft trigger things that I hated. And then the change to the DualShock 4 was a bit more noticeable, but the jump to this one, which is now being called the DualSense controller, is very, very different. Obviously, there's the fact that instead of being a black design, it is now a white and black mixture, and the overall grip shaping and everything looks like kind of a cross between what we know for the DualShock series controllers, but going a little bit in the direction of how the Xbox One style controller is. Not the exact same, but kind of a midpoint between the two. Aside from the redesigned grip and obviously the change in colors, a lot of the button placement though is still very much the same. We still have symmetrical sticks that are in the middle kind of bottom. Above those you have a D-pad on the left-hand side and front-facing buttons on the right-hand side, shoulder triggers. The share and options buttons have been slightly modified. The share button is no longer called the share button, it's now the create button, which PlayStation has said they will talk further about what exactly that means and what new features are going to come with that design. One little thing I noticed that I really like about this is that the PlayStation button in the center, instead of being a circular button with the logo, it's just a shaped cutout of the logo, which I think looks super cool. One other thing that was repositioned, and I'm really curious to see how it's going to be in person, is the light bar. So on the DualShock 4, the light bar is at the top of the controller where you can't normally really see it. Later redesigns of the DualShock 4 added that little tiny kind of see-through bar so you could at least catch a glimpse of it. Well, now they're actually going with something more along the lines of that concept, where the light bar is two lines that go on the side of the touchpad. So it's going to be on the front of the controller. It's a lot smaller and more subtle than the light bar that's on the front of DualShock 4s, so it's not going to be necessarily something that's going to distract you or blind you as lights coming up from your controller, but it adds a really kind of cool subtle look, and I'm interested in seeing how clearly visible it is if you're really using it, in real life in daylight. Obviously in nighttime it's probably going to show up nice and crisp. Now, as far as features go in the controller, there's been a lot of rumors and patents in the past that people have looked to figure out what's going on with PlayStation 5, and it turns out that quite a couple that people talked about are actually real. There's three specific features they mentioned that we've all heard about in the past and we now know are for sure in the controller, which are haptic feedback, adaptive triggers, and a built-in microphone. So let's break down each of those features one by one, starting with haptic feedback. So haptic feedback is a more advanced version of Rumble. We've seen it in a few things. Nintendo messes with their own version of it with their HD Rumble on Joy-Cons, and the entire idea is that the controller doesn't just simply shake in response to happening to things in-game, but instead it has very specific tunings to match what is happening. It can shake wildly, it can be very minute, it can do different paces to match what's happening in-game, so that way there's actually a higher degree of kind of sense of feedback from what's happening in game. This is actually why the controller is called the DualSense, because they really wanted to focus on the concept of the controller providing more direct feedback to players about what's happening in game. So to kind of build off the concept of, instead of DualShock, it's now DualSense. Now, the second feature, adaptive triggers, is probably the most interesting thing to me, because this is something that hasn't really been attempted on past controllers, and that's the concept of the tension in the triggers changes depending on what exactly it's doing in-game. So, for instance, if you're pulling back on right trigger to accelerate a car, that's not going to have the same tension as if you're pulling it to fire a gun in a different game, or pull back on a bowstring in yet another. This is another layer added to this whole concept of trying to add more immersive qualities to the controller and how it interacts with player feedback in-game, giving you a real sense of interacting with whatever action you're doing, which I find really interesting, and to be honest, I'm a little hesitant. I'm curious how many games are going to actually fully capitalize on this. Obviously, first-party PlayStation titles will, but as far as how much third parties embrace it and how the technology is used, I'm really curious to see it in an actual hands-on basis. And then third is the microphone. Now, they didn't go too full in depth on all the features of the microphone. There have been past rumors that the PlayStation 5 is going to have things like an AI assistant, so you can ask questions and they'll pop up on the screen and all that kind of stuff. Instead, they really just talked about how it's a microphone. If you don't have a headset or you don't want to plug a headset in, you can speak directly into it in order to chat with friends. So it adds a kind of convenience feature where if you ever want to do chat, you can just talk into your controller. Although I feel like it'll take a little getting used to, and I'm curious to see how far away you can speak clearly from it and have it actually go to friends well, especially if there's any kind of ambient noise going on where you are, like, you know, loud video games. One feature they did not mention that I do want to talk about a little bit is something that a lot of people speculated might be a part of the new controller, which is back buttons. When they made the back button attachment for the DualShock 4, a lot of people were wondering, well, hey, this is coming out so late for the PS4, is this a sign of something they're planning to have for the PS5? And as it stands, they have not announced that. But I think it's worth pointing out that in the promotional images they've shown so far for the DualSense controller, they have not shown the back. We see the side of the controller laying down, we see the front of it, we see a few close-ups, but we do not see the back of it. So I don't think the possibility of back buttons is gone. At the same time though, it'd be a little weird to save that as some kind of surprise. I think that's a cool feature, and I don't think it's one that necessarily needs to be kept under wraps, so it might not actually be a part of it. It could be released as a separate attachment the same way they approached it with the DualShock 4, but I'm not completely giving up hope that it's just going to be an integrated part of the controller. Because honestly, back buttons are such a common thing now amongst pro controllers and even more affordable third-party wired controllers. It just seems like something that should be a part of the mainline controllers now, and I feel like PlayStation was the most likely to do that. So hopefully we'll see that. Now, because we do have this official review of the controller, it's not going to stop people from starting to wonder, you know, what can we take from its design and infer about the PlayStation 5 itself. One thing a lot of people are talking about is the fact that it is a two-tone design. It is a white and black controller, so does that mean that the PS5 is going to be white and black? Or is it going to be just a straight-up white design? We're not quite sure, obviously, because we haven't seen what it looks like. We've seen the dev kits, which could give some idea of what the system might look similar to, but the fact the controller is working with these two colors means that we might start seeing that in the final system design itself. Of course, also knowing the features of the controller is going to stir up additional rumors and speculation about features of the system itself. Like I mentioned earlier, there were previous rumors that because the system was going to have a built-in mic, it might have some kind of assistant setup. We still don't know that. Again, we don't know anything about the actual PS5 itself as far as the interface or software or anything. We just know hardware specs, and now we know this controller. So honestly, this is actually the first bit of news for the PS5 that I'm super hyped for. I'm a little mixed on the visual look of the DualSense, I'm not gonna lie, but as far as the functions and features go, I think it's gonna be something really cool. So those are my thoughts on the DualSense controller. Let me know down below what you guys are thinking. Do you like the controller? Do you hate the design? Do you think it's ugly? Are you starting to speculate about certain functions and features the PS5 might have as a result? And really, more than anything, does this make you more excited for the PS5 or not? As always, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you later.